I'm really very excited to have this panel discussion on a really new and original subject, and I can't think of one that's more important. My name is Clint Vince. I chair Dentons U.S. Energy Practice, and I co-chair our global energy sector with my teammate Emma Hand, and we also co-chair the Dentons Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank, and this is one of our special additions. We're really pleased that we are doing this together with the Keystone Policy Center as part of their Key Conversations program. And so we're going to have Christine Scanlon, the extraordinary CEO of Keystone, give our welcome. And then Paula Gold-Williams, the chair of the board of Keystone, will comment as well, and then we'll get underway. So Christine, please go ahead.
Well, good morning, Clint. And I want to say a special thank you to everyone who is participating. This is an amazingly talented, brilliant group of people that are assembled this morning. I'm calling in from beautiful Keystone, Colorado. So this is starting off my Monday morning in my week. And I couldn't be more thrilled to hear and listen to this really important and timely conversation. So I just want to extend my thanks to Dentons. These webinars are always impactful for myself and such interesting and timely topics. So with that, Clint, I think we can get rolling.
Thank you, Christine. Paula?
Very good. Clint, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, I want to reiterate what Christine said. It is Keystone's honor to participate on these seminars to bring topics of interest forward, to really have critical conversations. Maybe constructive conversations would be a better comment. So I'm super excited about this one. I think the industry is in such a odd place. It's so hard to figure out a path forward, and there are a ton of great intentions. However, trust, sometimes I've said we weaponize trust over the years, but I do think it is a real key. And I want to thank very much Sandra and Lawrence for taking on this topic to help us focus on it. And then again, it's the board of Keystone, all the people that participate in this organization believe in the concept of trust and partnership. And I also want to thank Steve for being here today. Steve is the voice of our industry in such a rational, collaborative way. So I'm super looking forward to this conversation. You know, the last thing I want to say is, though, one thing that Keystone does is really focus on a portfolio of subjects. And what I've been really proud of about the organization is there has been a focus on trust. And in one example I will share, there's a lot of work with indigenous people and tribes, because I would say from our beginnings of our history, there has been a struggle in trust. And a lot of it is coming forward now. But what we really have is an opportunity. So Keystone has focused on a way to work with tribes, in particular the Ute tribe, and figure out how can we build trust? How can we be respectful? How can we honor their culture? How can we support them? How can we create partnership? And I think it's a great example of that effort and that collaboration. That said, that is one step. And I do think it's a much broader conversation. It's a global conversation about trust. So I'm super excited to be involved in this conversation today to support what we're going to hear, to support and advocate for the paper that has been written. And I thank all of you and hope that you really enjoyed and can participate freely today.
Thank you, Paula and Christine. Great opening comments. Now we're just going to get right into it. And I'm going to introduce all three of our distinguished panelists right away. First, my dear friend, Dr. Lawrence Jones. Lawrence is an award-winning thought leader in the energy industry. He is heads the international programs of the Edison Electric Institute. He has expanded those members in his programs to more than 60 utilities operating in more than 90 countries at the present time. And if you ever have an opportunity to tune into one of his global panels or webinars, you really don't want to miss that opportunity. Lawrence was born in Liberia, but he was educated in Sweden, got his doctorate, a PhD in electrical engineering from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. So he can speak to us in Swedish or other languages at will. And Lawrence has just too many awards and prestigious affiliations to list right now. But of importance for today, he is the co-author of a publication entitled How to Rebuild Trust, Question Storming to Create a Platform for Thinking Differently and Taking New Actions. This publication will be the centerpiece of our discussion today. And Lawrence's co-author is Sandra Baer, who is with us as well. And Sandra is the CEO of Personal Cities. She recently received the Smart City Leadership Award at the Global CSR Conference in Mumbai. Sandra is currently the brand ambassador for Smart Cities World, and she holds, as with Lawrence, a number of other significant advisory positions. Our third panelist, another dear friend for decades now, Steve Midnick, is the executive editor of Public Utilities Fortnightly. He is the president of its parent company, Lines Up. And Steve has completely revitalized Public Utility Fortnightly. Prior to becoming an energy journalist, Steve was a leader with several prestigious consulting firms, McKinsey and Company, PHB Hagler-Bailly, and Marsh & McLennan. Steve did not drink beer in college, I don't think. He has an MBA from Wharton and 2 Bachelors of Science degrees from Rensselaer Polytech Institute. The Bachelor of Science degrees are in physics and in history and political science. So he truly has a broad spectrum mind and is a great contributor whenever we have webinars where he is included. What I most admire about Steve, though, is his recent authorship of some very original and important publications. He's written Lines Down about the grid during storms, which I hope we'll get into discussion today in terms of trust. Steve wrote a book about Lewis Latimer, the first hidden figure who had tremendous role in many of the great inventions of our industry, but was not publicized because he was African American. Steve has written a book on women leading utilities, the pioneers and path to today and tomorrow. And he is just completing a book called Front Lines to Power Lines about military veterans in the utility industry. It's these books really that caused me to want to include Steve on this panel to discuss rebuilding trust. And so with that really oversimplified introduction of 3 great thought leaders in our industry, I'm going to start with Lawrence and just ask, what what inspired you to write about rebuilding trust?
First of all, Clint, good morning, and thanks for having us here. I should first say that when Sandra and I thought about where we would launch this report, we couldn't think of a better place being Denton. Clint, yourself and some of your members of your organization were part of the question storming sessions. And we thought, what a best place to do this than a law firm, given the fact that obviously trust is ingrained in what lawyers do. So we thought, perfect, let's go and let's have Denton host it. Well, over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of reports about trust. In fact, we've seen a lot of reports about the erosion of trust around the world. And so about 3 or 4 years ago, Sandra and I, we got together and said, look, there's a lot of talk about trust, loss of trust, trust erosion, trust deficit, but nobody is doing anything about it. And so the question we began to ask ourselves was, well, look, it's enough to do all the statistics, enough to do all the measurements, but how do you actually rebuild trust? And that question, the fact that we've seen enough reports all over the world about trust erosion, from Scandinavia to Africa to the United States, you pick anywhere in the world, you pick up a report, you will see something about trust erosion of trust in governments, erosion in institutions, even trust between family members. So that was the impetus of us saying, okay, let's not ask any more questions about trust erosion. Let's do something about it. And the question was, so how do you rebuild trust? And so that was the idea that spurred us to sit down and start thinking about this particular question, realizing that without trust, we can do nothing. And so that's what got us going, and that led us to thinking about the best way. And the outcome of this was then, let's do this whole thing we developed called Question Storming.
Lawrence, I've got a dear friend in special ops who described the world right now as a busy world. I would really describe it as a jagged world, unbelievably so. And I'm just wondering, you focus on the concept of trust deficit in your paper. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, think about it this way, right? The whole idea of trust deficit, there are so many different definitions. And one of the things we try not to do in this paper, Clint, is to get too theoretical. So practically, what is the trust deficit? Well, it's the same kind of deficit you will find in your bank account if you haven't invested into your bank account. If you see a sort of a lack of funds in your bank account. Trust deficit is when people start to not trust one another, and that lack of trust starts to grow. You see the deficit. Just like you have deficit in economists, you have deficit in other aspects of our lives. We see this trust deficit mean people are less trusting of one another. And when that gap between how much people trust each other starts to grow, you have the deficit. And so when we travel around the world, Sandra and I independently, we discovered more and more that people were not just trusting one another. And this thing was just growing and growing and growing. And so for us, deficit means you don't have enough trust in another person. And the deficit is when you have less trust than confidence in an individual, the deficit starts to grow. So in essence, that's what the trust deficit is all about.
Thank you, Lawrence. Sandra, let me ask you the same question. What inspired you to write this piece?
Well, thank you, Clint, and also special thanks to Dentons and the Keystone Policy Center. We're thrilled to be a part of, we're thrilled to have you be a part of our launch of this important research. I will say that Lawrence and I are of one mind when it comes to the importance of rebuilding trust. And many years ago, as Lawrence pointed out, we were both working with city leaders around the world and really helping them look at difficult issues, whether it was energy or transport or climate or social and racial issues. Whatever the challenge, I immediately observed over the past 20 years that cities are too quick to jump to answers. They're too quick to take on solutions without really understanding the interdependencies of all the difficulty of those questions. And because they hadn't really thought through, it became immediately clear to me that there's a better path, there's a better way for us to find meaningful solutions. So as I work with cities, my passion is to help them find new solutions and really peel the onion of a difficult question. I believe H.L. Mencken said it best. He said, for every difficult question, there is an answer that is simple and clear and wrong. So this was the idea that I think led Lawrence and me on this journey to really look at some of the world's most wicked problems. I would add one other thing about the trust deficit. I think the problems of the trust deficit are so familiar to all of us. There's the best examples. For example, if we disagree about the causes or solutions related to the climate crisis, if we disagree about the results of an election in any country around the world, it really jeopardizes our ability to work together. It keeps us from looking forward and fixing problems. It really endangers our basic values and our basic democratic rule of law. So that's where the trust deficit is something Lawrence and I said, we've got to work on this.
We're really seeing it now everywhere, from the utility industry up to the United States Supreme Court. We're seeing it in places that where we would not have expected to see it 5 or 10 years ago. And so I really commend you. I mean, I can't think of a more essential topic for the societal well-being. Lawrence, can you tell us a little bit about this process of question storming that you have used to develop you and Sandra have used to kind of develop your concepts?
Sure. So, the idea in essence is, whenever you start to solve a problem, and the good thing about this thing that Sandra and I came from different academic background, right? She's into marketing, I'm into engineering, and we have a different approach to the world based on our professional expertise. But once we sat down and started to think about how do you deal with these kinds of wicked problems like rebuilding trust, the idea behind question storming is, first of all, like brainstorming or unlike brainstorming, the idea is not initially to find a solution. The idea is to first take one big problem, or just any problem for that matter, frame it as a question, and then you begin to unpeel the onion, if you may, by asking more questions. What makes question storming unique is that you generate a lot of insights by hearing the next person's question. And so the idea is you start with a question, in this case was how to rebuild trust. And then you sit down and you start to say, okay, what are the questions we can ask about that question? It's almost like an iterative process. The only difference is that to do question storming, we require that the very first 45 minutes or even an hour is only dedicated to asking questions. And that is very difficult because we all, from the time we were born, we learn to answer questions. In fact, I always said we're in a society, an answering society. It's all about giving answers to questions. And if you don't have the answer, people consider you to not be an expert. So what happens is everybody wants to be an expert. The question storming says, wait a second, you don't need to be an expert. What questions are affecting your thought process? And by understanding many questions that are interrelated to that one big question, you begin to get new insights. And the more insights you get, the more questions you ask. And then at the end of the very first part of the exercise, we go from question storming to what we call solution storming. And the unique thing about this thing is, Clint, you can apply it to any question. In fact, you can apply it in your home. You can have a question storming session with your wife, with your husband, with your brother, with your sister. Because at the end of the day, it forces you to not jump to quick conclusions. And I think we as a society around the world, by the way, we're all driven by answers. And what we're saying is, wait a second, have you asked all the right questions? And so for us, question storming is ask as many questions before you start jumping to the solution. In fact, that's what it is in essence. And by the way, we spoke to someone who was a journalist a couple of days ago, and the person thought this was what journalists do. And I said, the difference is we're not asking the question. We're actually getting the participants to ask the question. And that's different, right? So the journalist asks you the question. In question storming, we have the participants themselves to think about the questions. And when they ask the questions, the insights they get is even more impactful.
And Clint, I might add one more thing about the rules of question storming. Not only are you only allowed to ask questions, and you must listen intensively to the other questions, but when we start the process, we do not allow you to give your title or your credentials or your accomplishments. The only introduction you're allowed to make in a question storming session is to give your name, your location, and your passion. And I'm telling you, within the span of 90 minutes, these 15 to 20 people form a bond because they realize that they can see the problem through the lens of other people. Question storming requires you to listen to that and to move forward thinking differently.
And why we remove, by the way, Clint, thanks for bringing that up. Why we remove the titles, Clint? Because we discover that once you start a conversation with titles, it biases the reaction of people. And so when people got on those calls, we had people from, we had diplomats, we had, people who were leaders in the profession, we had young people. But because the playing field was equalized, no one knew that they were talking to a PhD, a medical doctor, a pastor, an imam. We had all those people. The only thing they had in common was their name, where they live, and their passion. And that's what you have to do. Get rid of the titles and just focus on those three things.
One thing I should have really mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, and since we are talking about question storming, I do want to invite members of the audience, the participants, at any point, if you have a question, just write it into the Q&A section of the Zoom platform, and I'll monitor that. It would really help me if you don't put it in the chat room, because if I try to monitor the chat and the Q&A session and pay attention to our conversation, it'll make me dizzy. So just put it into the Q&A section. And Lawrence, a moment ago, you talked about not identifying the roles and positions of different people, but you really accomplished tremendous diversity in your outreach. Can you describe that a little bit?
Sure. So one of the things we said this out was to really get people from diverse backgrounds, irrespective of ethnicity, culture, diversity, gender, demographics. And so we had, again, over 200 people from around the world. And by the way, some of those people are actually on the call, so I'm glad to see some of them here. And different cultures. And why we did that was because trust, as universal as it is, it also has to be put in certain contexts, right? And so we had a very diverse group. We even did a session, Clint, with young people between the ages of 10 and 15. And Sandra and I, we agree that was perhaps the most intriguing session we had, because they had no biases, right? And I always joke, one of the most interesting questions that came from the session with young people was a question about, why do you trust your parents? Well, guess what? My daughter was on that call. And so I had to answer up to her, Daddy, why can I trust you? But I think the point is, Sandra and I felt that it was important to be very diverse. Trust is no one has monopoly on trust. We have to view it from the other person's perspective. And I think bringing these people together from all walks of life. I mean, we have people on the call from New Zealand, from Malaysia, from Saudi Arabia. We have people from Sweden, from Germany, very diverse cultural background. And what was so intriguing was, and Sarah can speak to this, how they found a bond towards the end of the conversation, because at the end, they didn't even know the titles, but they were able to bond around the questions they were addressing.
Let's ask Sandra to elaborate on that. And you've described this as kind of the question storming process is sort of a life-changing experience for members in the focus groups. Can you discuss that a little bit more?
Of course, forever I could talk about this, because think about the opportunity to see a difficult problem from many perspectives, not just your opinion about it, just your circle of friends. I mean, some of the key questions illustrated the expansiveness of questioning. What is trust? How do you define it? How do you define it in different cultures? How do we measure it? Can we teach it? Can we learn to be trustworthy? What about the relationship of trust and government? Trust and our political leaders? What about the relationship of trust and social media? How does it affect our trustworthiness? Can you trust technology? So we came up with, and also these questions about, can you trust your neighbors? Can you trust your dog? I mean, the entire panoply of questions, the thoughtfulness, it expanded our thinking about it. It opened our hearts and our minds to a new way of looking at a problem. It made us more compassionate. And I think, it was a liberating fact in terms of question storming. It's why people formed a bond at the end of the session. These people had no idea who they were or what their titles were, and they were all trading emails by the end of the session. So I think it just proves what Lawrence was saying earlier. You can do this process of question storming on trust, And you can do it about the purpose of your business. You can do it about a town council meeting for a city. You can do it with your family members. I mean, really, Clint, it is life-changing.
I remember one session I was in where the subject of a dog's trust came in, and it brought to mind a comment I had read many years ago in New Yorker, that you should not trust your dog's admiration as conclusive evidence that you're wonderful.
So true, so true.
Lawrence, what were some of the some of the most unexpected questions that you observed?
So at the end of the exercise, Glenn, we had over 1,000 questions, right? And we had to narrow it down. But I think a couple of questions that stood out to me during this 9-month process. One was the question around, can we teach each other to be trustworthy? Or how can we teach trust? That stood out to me because, society, we talk about trust a lot, but we don't realize that trust is something that it doesn't just happen. It's a process. And so the question about how do you teach trust is one that stood out to me. The other one that stood out to me was this issue around when can you trust someone after you've lost their trust, right? Because where we are right now, I was reading an article from the OECD talking about when governments lose trust, how do they rebuild trust in a society? It's a very interesting question because when you lose trust, that whole process of rebuilding trust is an evolutionary thing. So that stood out as well. The last one that stood out, which I still ponder over, is when do people start trusting another person? And I bring that up because, for me at least, in the context of trust, is why did people trust me and Sandra to get together with 15 strangers and literally get intellectually hijacked, right? What made them trust Sandra and trust me? And we can even have this conversation around this call right now. When I moved to Washington, D.C., one of my mentors was a guy called Clint Vince. Well, why did I trust him, right? Or why does, I mean, if you think about it, that's for me what I find most fascinating. Why do people trust one another? And I think that's something we need to spend more time on, and just assuming that, oh, people will trust me. No, it's something you earn. You earn it.
Sandra, what about your perception? What questions surprised you the most?
I think the ones that were most relevant, especially to younger audiences that we queried, were around social media. How do we consider our research, our view of the world, our friendships with people, our relationships with people with whom we completely disagree? Everyone is influenced now by social media. And Clint, we're not going backwards. I don't think we're going to change the impact of social media to be non-important. And so I think those questions around technology and social media, and actually it certainly has an impact in the energy industry, because the need for all of us to sort of be open. And one of the insights that we came up with from this difficult question was, can you reach out to people with whom you disagree? Can you have a conversation with them? Can you keep asking questions rather than jumping to an answer or prejudging it or having a prejudice or a bias? Because these questions really do illuminate our fears, our biases, which is part of the reason that we have trouble asking difficult questions.
I would say, yes, Lawrence.
Quickly, and Sandra and I hadn't discussed this before, but one of the insights I got was both Sandra and I are people who have opinions. And why this exercise was difficult for us was, as facilitators of the question storming exercise, I had to find myself silent for 90 minutes because I could not opine on anything people were saying. And I think for me, the self-realization that I learned a lot by just asking questions, but then listening to other people's questions. That can be difficult for an executive because you're supposed to have ideas. You're supposed to give answers. And yeah, I'm not telling you, no, I don't want your answers. I want you to ask questions. And for me, I'm good at it now, but the first couple of sessions I did, it was a struggle because I'm like, wait a second, what is this guy asking, right? So nice to think for executives to be able patiently listening and not responding quickly to the questions you're hearing.
You know, I would encourage you and Sandra to examine the inverse of the point you were just making. You mentioned silence, sometimes how important it is. I think one of the best pieces of advice I've ever received is there are times when you should say nothing and say it often. Well,
We're going to quote you, Clint.
let me switch gears a little bit. I'd like to bring Steve Midnick into our conversation now and really have him sort of be our practical sage with the utility industry. And Steve, what are you seeing in terms of the trust deficit that Lawrence and Sandra have described?
Well, the electric utility industry mistrust almost comes with the business. So that's something that really cropped up starting, let's say, in the 1890s. And so that's been a constant. That's the construct, the wonderful construct of our industry is where there are monopoly utilities, there's no competition, and that we build our infrastructure to be invisible, so you can't see the positive of you're not aware of the utilities until something goes wrong, and that there's tremendous politicization and media attention on the bad things, which is whenever costs, the rates have to go up, or whenever the power goes off in a storm. So that's been true for 130 years. And well before the more recent days of obnoxious conspiracy theories, there were conspiracy theories about how utilities were managed in the 1890s and the 1900s and 1910s. And some of our, two presidents of the United States, at least, I can think of more, but Franklin Roosevelt and Bill Clinton, they built their careers on mistrust of utilities. So, so we've had that for a while. I'm not sure that it's any different now that given all the trust deficit, if you will, that is elsewhere. We still have that, and it's fundamental to what utilities do.
When CEOs of utilities ask you for advice about rebuilding trust, how do you respond?
There's things that we can do. Of course, that's such a priority, and it's so important to leaders. So if you think about trust in any respect, in any field, one of the things to dispel that is to show that you're trying. I love baseball, and you can have your team lose plenty of games, but it matters if your batter hitting a ground ball runs as hard as he can to first base, even if he's out. That the center fielder bangs up against the wall to try to make that catch. So trying hard matters a lot. That's the terrible tragedy at Uvalde, where the police forces apparently didn't try hard, is one of the things that makes people angriest. So trying hard matters. When we respond to storms in Puerto Rico or Texas or wherever, showing that we're going all out really matters. But also something that the utilities have never been able to do well, but can do, is to show the sausage being made. With engineers, and the industry has always been modest about our equipment. We always want to keep it hidden. keep it out of visual range, but showing our beautiful infrastructure and what we spend money on, so that the customer can actually see, the public can actually see that we're trying to do our best, and that that bill actually goes for something that's positive.
You know, you mentioned storms, and I do a lot of public hearings, especially for some of our municipal clients. I would say that two areas recently that I've seen that sow distrust are the increase in extreme turbulent weather and extreme weather events causing outages, and also pricing issues that utilities might have very little or no control over, such as an electric industry being faced with increased fuel costs, increased gas prices from partially resulting from the invasion of Ukraine. As distant as that, what are you seeing in that regard, and what could, building on your earlier comment, what could utilities do to rebuild trust in these areas? Because the extreme weather is only getting worse now.
Yeah, when hamburger becomes more expensive, or that electronic gadget increases in price, you may resent it for a moment, and that's it. But it's fundamental to the way that we handle utilities that every change in our prices is announced, is transparently discussed ad nauseum for months, that opponents are literally invited and sometimes paid to bring up their, arguments and resentments and whatever. So we're automatically subject ourselves, for good reason, because we are in the public interest, and we want the public to understand and to agree to whatever they're paying for utilities. So there is that. What can we do about that? It's fundamental to what we do. We don't want to change that transparency. We don't want to change that ability for the public and media to look in every little corner. So, but we can show positively more of what we do. Right now, there's tremendous focus on investing in the infrastructure to make it stronger, harder, more resilient, as we say. Those can be big dollars, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars even. And so that's an automatic headline or series of headlines for any news organization, and is fearsome and frightening to the public. So, but we don't show what that money goes for. Why don't we show what it goes for? That, for example, at PG&E in California, they're talking about undergrounding those lines. And that has commanded tremendous public support, because the public can say, well, the utility, they want to spend all this money, but we're getting something for it. They're trying. And so I just think it's showing us more of what we do, the good and bad.
Steve, in our run-up show, you mentioned something that really kind of shocked me. And I think of public utility fortnightly, especially under your leadership, and Joe and Alex and the amazing team that you work with. You told me that public utility fortnightly gets hate mail.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, that's again, that's part of the. So Public Utilities Fortnightly, its original parent company was founded in 1914. And it was founded in 1928. There was hate mail then. So it's not much different, because energy is, think about electricity in particular, your electric service. It's something that can be turned off instantaneously. it's almost as impactful as if you were suffocating from air. Even the water problem that we have in Jackson, Mississippi, it's terrible to not have water utilities. But we can go on, we can actually survive, but electricity hits you like that. And so it's very politicized, it creates anger. It's almost 2% of the GDP of the United States. So there's a lot of money involved. There are a lot of interests that want to protect or build their businesses. And so these days, yeah, people carry out their frustrations and angers and aspirations and jealousies on us somewhat. It's okay. We're resilient too.
I'd like to come back and ask Lawrence and Sandra a quick question about storms. Lawrence mentioned it in our session just before we began this webinar. And then I'm going to ask Paula Go-Williams. I think she has a question or two also to pose to both Lawrence and Sandra. So Lawrence, you were talking about Puerto Rico in the context of trust and rebuilding trust and so on. Did you want to explain that?
Sure. One of the things, big in what Steve said, I think one of the challenges we have as an industry, but as a world, is that trust can be broken for all kinds of reasons, and sometimes when organizations are being sort of held accountable for different things, the trust that they're losing is not because of an act on their own. It's sometimes things beyond their control, right? So we have the storm in Puerto Rico, for example. We have the situation in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of these externalities can, to some extent, have an impact on trust. And why? Because of the expectations. People have an expectation on certain things. And when those expectations are not met, trust gets affected. And so one of the things that concerns me as we expand this conversation to the world, future generations, is that what can we do to make sure that the expectations that we are setting as leaders, as in families, in relationships, that those expectations are realistic? Because once you do not satisfy those expectations, trust begins to erode. And so the situation in Puerto Rico now, because of Hurricane Fiona, they've done a good job to rebuild the infrastructure there. They were headed in the right direction, and then back comes this externality, which is now going to put them back, right? But the public may not understand that. The public has a certain expectation. The same thing on a one-on-one relationship. As we look at society right now, all the big issues we're facing, Clint, my fear is that if we don't manage expectations, the expectations could end up impacting trust, because if they're not being met, I have this exercise all the time when people will say, well, you didn't do what your spouse asked you to do. Well, what was my spouse expecting me to do, right? So managing expectation in the context of trust is extremely important, especially as leaders. Unfortunately, in the context of politics, sometimes expectations are way beyond what is realistic. And where leadership comes in is to be fair and reasonable in terms of what expectations you're setting, because expectations, if they're not met, trust gets eroded.
Thank you, Lawrence. Sandra, I know you have some views on expectations and how to balance those against agreements and commitments.
Well, and I want to pick up on Lawrence's comment about political values. I mean, just to be clear, Lawrence and I are very focused on a definition of politics that has nothing to do with political parties or conservative or liberal thinking or right and left. I mean, if Lawrence and I had our way, we would eliminate these labels. But beyond that, I think the idea that we set expectations, that we create agreements with people that maybe are separate from any kind of political party much more about character and values and what we care about, what matters to us as human beings and as to citizens of the planet. I was just in Miami at the Smart City Expo USA and met with many entrepreneurs that are dealing with all kinds of externalities, whether they be nature-based or man-made. And I think, Clint, that we're really at a position where these entrepreneurs, these Gen Z folks, they're going to be the questioners of our future. They're going to ask the right questions to create the new technologies, the new solutions that enable a new quality of life. So I wanted to mention that in the context of political thinking, because we really strive through question storming to be completely nonpartisan.
How did you accomplish that in your process? I noticed that in your report, you were able to keep politics out of the process somehow. How did you do that?
Part of it was the way we set it up. We were cognizant that the titles and accomplishments, credentials of the people on the call could influence or intimidate others in asking a question. But if you eliminate that, I think we're really good at making everyone feel in their comfort zone in terms of asking a question. But as Paula might have alluded earlier, out of your comfort zone. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be fearful that it will affect your ability to get reelected, your ability to offend your boss. I mean, think about the value of a question and think that it's clear that we're sort of all on a level playing field here, that we can proceed with the pursuit of really solving a problem and hopefully reimagining it. I mean, what we learned from some of those answers, some of those questions were ideas that were never thought of before. So we can give you many more examples of that in the real world, but I think the idea is to keep politics out of it, to make people feel like they can ask a question and not be jeopardized for it.
And may I just add one quick comment before Paula comes in? And the other beauty of this is that questions are neutral. They are innocent. What makes a question difficult or what makes it political is the response. So I ask a question until I get an answer. It's just a question. And that's the beauty of questions. Questions are politically agnostic. It's when you start to answer the question, that's when it becomes something different. And so you could take one question, and I can take that question to 5 different countries. The responses to those questions will lean it one way or the other. But from the standpoint of understanding the issue, I don't need to know your political ideology to ask you the question. And so I think that the way we're successful in keeping politics out of the equation is because we're not giving you answers. And when people try, there was one session where a certain participant from a certain country, a very influential person who has a big title, tried to impede the process with his response. And Sandra said, "Nope, sir, you're not going to stop. We're going to get you off the session." That's why they were able to tune himself down. But I think the beauty, and it does not listen to this, and any message I wanted to take clear is questions are innocent. It's the responses to the questions that become political.
Thank you, Lawrence and Sandra. Paula, did you have a couple of questions you wanted to pose?
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm sitting here taking notes about the great content that we're hearing today. I do. I have a question for Sandra and I have a question for Lawrence. So the paper is a great read. You know, it's very manageable. But I wanted to ask a question. Inherently in the subtitle, there's a definite call on the reader to think about this in terms of things they can do. The platform that they can create to think differently and take new action, right? We're always thinking about that. And that said, could you delve a bit more on the pathway to do that? I mean, that's something that can help our listeners today too, in terms of content.
Right. And Paula, that is the perfect question. People say to me, what do you mean? You're just asking a bunch of questions. What good is that to me? You know, how am I going to solve this problem? But the truth is that it's not really about immediate answers. In fact, this question, Paula, how can we rebuild trust in a broken world? We would call that complex. There is not a single answer. There's not a single path to restoring trust. But what we found were insights. Lawrence and I particularly did not call them answers. But for example, Paula, we found that you'd understand the importance of ownership, that you are individually responsible, that you are accountable. And, I think people will think, oh, it's just me. What can I do? But the truth is, once you're in a question storming session, you feel empowered to take action. And whatever that is, maybe it's another question storming session. Maybe it's gathering a different group of people to approach the problem. The second thing is that you learn about the impact of communication and social media. And as I said earlier, what are your sources of information? Can you broaden them? Can you think differently? Can you listen to a TV channel that you don't normally listen to? Can you ask your friends or colleagues a question, why do you believe this? And they may say, well, I've done my research, but we don't even allow that answer because we're really getting to, what's the core of your belief? And can we find a common ground? Finally, there's this need to continually question your thinking. Do I really know the answer to that question? Or is it just based on my small world, my narrow view of life? And I can speak as a white woman, now over 30, really being so clueless about racial and social injustice as I was growing up as a child. Now I feel like question storming has unleashed my new thinking about that. So I feel like there's all kinds of ways in which we can take action. It's not a single step, but it is the path. It is the launch pad for doing more.
And
I'm sorry.
What Sandra said, and I think the other thing that the insight that I got, we got out of this was the fact that the question provokes your own thinking, right? So the pathway here is, everyone has an aha moment, right? And how people say, well, you've said it before, I'm sure, when you said, I hadn't thought about that, right? Everyone has a sort of a pondering moment in their life. Well, what we say is, I haven't asked that question. So it's like, just like you get an aha moment when you hear something, you get a lot of aha moments when you hear a question. And so the pathway here is, don't be convinced that you have the answer. And don't be convinced that you have the right question, because maybe you're asking the wrong question. And what questions does, it challenges assumptions. It challenges your assumptions by questioning the assumptions. And that is very hard. And given where the world is today, we have to really question our assumptions, but nobody wants to do it. So that's what question storming really helps. Is like, you're not right, the wrong issue. It's just probing and asking the question about the assumption.
Very good. Thank you. I'd like to then kind of pull on that string a little bit, Lawrence. So maybe something practical that everybody's gone through, and link that. It was fascinating for me to realize that this question storming process that I believe lasted about 9 months happened in 2020, the pandemic, right? And what I want to also understand is how much did that global crisis affect the way that you thought about doing that question storming process then? And was that a huge factor? How did that come through? And were there other factors, particularly that as we were going through the pandemic, that came out because of that new thing that no one had ever seen a pandemic do?
Interesting. So the very first question storming session we did was at Sandra's house before the pandemic. Clint was there. We had a couple of diplomats. This was an in-person question storming session. So had the pandemic not happened, we were probably going to try and do this in person. But then what the pandemic did provide us was the opportunity to go global. So the pandemic brought us the opportunity to not question Washington, D.C., but hey, why not question storm in Bogota? Why not question storm in Rio de Janeiro? So the pandemic, to some extent, actually created an opportunity for us to expand question storming beyond the streets of Washington, D.C. The in-person was very intriguing because, and Clayton was there, it was even more difficult in person because you're looking at someone in their eye and you're telling them, you cannot make a statement, you can only ask a question. So going digital allowed us to get people from Sweden, from Germany, from South Africa, and it made the research even better. And I should say, what was also challenging for Sandra and I, we were doing this independently of our normal day job. We're just doing it because of our passion for this issue. And so many of the people who came on board, we had to convince them, so look, we're doing this because we think it's important for the world. We're not being paid. Can you give us 90 minutes of your time? And people said, sure, we can. And so that's how we got more support from around the world, because this was like it wasn't something that we're benefiting from. It was something that the world can benefit from if we can come together and really drill into this topic.
Thank you. We took a tragedy and made it an opportunity.
There you go.
All right. Well, Clint, thank you for the ability to interject. I found this all fascinating.
Thank you, Paula. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but in a moment, I'd like to also ask Christine to comment, because it sounds to me like a lot of what you've accomplished through the process of question storming is something that Keystone does. They use a different format, but they do it in an extraordinary way. Probably one of the most effective groups. And I have full disclosure, I've served on their board for decades, but one of the most effective groups at bringing people together from all different points on the compass. And Sandra, I think your words were giving them a zone of safety to be able to express themselves. Steve Midnick, can you think of a way that you could employ question storming or this type of process in your discussion with utility CEOs or other members of the industry?
Yeah, I first of all, it sounds it's just fascinating listening to you all, and so interesting. So I think that there's real good potential in such an important area for utilities, and that is talking and understanding and listening to the customer. Many of the companies say that the customer is central to everything they do, and they mean that. But it's really hard to kind of break through and to really communicate with them. So it would be extraordinary to see if question storming could be tried out with folks from the companies talking with folks in their communities. And that would be really, that would be fun to see, and maybe enormous potential.
I have to agree with you. There's so much need for improved dialogue, and it's, we're not going in the right direction right now. We seem to be really this trust deficit that Lawrence and Sandra have described. It seems to be enlarging rather than shrinking. Christine, as I was listening to Lawrence and Sandra, it sounded to me like this might be something that you do on a daily basis in using a different process. But just a few days ago, it would have been Christine's and my mentor, Robert Craig's birthday. He's no longer living, but he was the founder of Keystone, just a giant of a human being. And he founded the Keystone process. Do you want to take a second and describe? I wasn't anticipating that we would get into this, but do you want to take a second and react?
Thank you, Clint. And boy, I was having the same, reaction and feeling about listening to this and how important the work is. We at Keystone, we have a saying that progress only moves at the speed of trust. And it's completely true. And if we can't engender that trust with our participants, and you're exactly right, when you put aside the role and the affiliation and we allow people to speak as individuals And we do that in our work as well. We don't ask for any formal agreement until the very end of a process normally, where they can then represent the views of their organization, company, or what have you. Then it becomes relational. And then you start to build relationship. And our work is founded on the belief that when people can actually connect in a way where they feel both heard and there is trust that surrounds the conversation, then you can start to bridge some of these really enormous challenges in today's world around disparate views and polarized positions. So Clint, I appreciate you linking this back to Keystone, because that is entirely our foundation and what our founder, Bob Craig, brought forward in a very unique way. He also put that with the idea of get people out of their environment when you can, and enable them to not just see that person across the table from them as an opponent or someone that they're doing battle with, but as a human. And so this is really, really echoing our mission and our principles that we bring to our work. But again, progress only moves forward at the speed of trust. And without that, you will not move. So I really appreciate the conversation today.
Thank you for joining in with us, Christine. Bob Craig used to say that it's hard for people to stay angry with each other if they're skiing together during a break or having a meal together in the evening. And I've seen bitter enemies in the Keystone process really over time, not immediately, but over time, really narrow their differences. And I don't often think of it this way, but a huge component of that was just increasing trust. Sandra, you have lots of recommendations for action and trust ambassadors and so on. Can you tell us how we are going to take the findings of your report and Lawrence's and really put that into action where we will make a positive difference?
You bet, Clint. That's my favorite question. Lawrence, our intention is to build trustworthiness, for each of us to become models of trust, to really find new ways of thinking about our differences. And I think, the question is, can we break the silos in which we live and work? Can we truly listen to others without prejudice or prejudging ideas before we start talking to them? But I think we would both encourage people to become what we call trust ambassadors. And to do that, you have to address the tough questions, whether it's in your work, in your professional life, whether it's at school, whether it's within your family unit. Certainly for me, it's within cities, because I know they are struggling to recover from COVID and to also adapt new technologies, new ways of running their city. But I think if you can come up with a tough question, and I think there are a million, but it could be on the climate crisis, immigration, social and racial justice. There's so many tough questions surrounding us today that are not new, but yet different. If you can come up with those tough questions, Lawrence and I would love to help you frame them and to conduct a session. I think, it's really hard to sort of keep people on track. But once you do that, you're reshaping the way you think about something. And we've said it a couple times today. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about it and explain it. We would love to create a community of trust ambassadors. I think certainly in cities around the world, communities large and small, people are struggling. And I think, if we could improve the quality of life in a city, in a community, we will have fulfilled my passion and Lawrence's too. So thank you, Clint. It's just been a joy to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you. In our Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank, one of the big additions we made right up front, first of all, smart cities had been discussed and birthed really as a concept of technology. and digital technology in particular, and all of the benefits that that would bring. But we feel really that it's much more than that, that it's the essential thing for cities is to completely modernize their infrastructure.
Yep.
But we define that as not only digital and physical infrastructure, but social
Right.
infrastructure. And the more that we have delved into this and worked with groups of people, we find that social infrastructure needs the most work right now.
That's right. And if I
And,
could just add one other thing,
yeah.
Clint, because it's sort of, you know, what I see in cities around the world is this is the way we've always done it. This is our traditional way of doing business. Our procurement document is 30 pages long, and that's the way it is. So, you know, how do you step out of that? And so my only request of our audience today is that you have the courage, really. And I think it takes courage to say, this is not the way we've always done it. We will discover approaches never thought of before. I promise it will be worth it. Just wanted to add that comment.
Yeah, I really think we need to take your suggestions and really focus much harder on rebuilding trust and
Yes.
candid discussion of the trust deficit, because that is probably one of the largest intractable problems right now. Lawrence,
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, Glenn, before
yes,
on that point about, you know, the rebuilding trust. You know, given where the world is today, we have COP27 coming up in Egypt. We have the issues around global inflation. We have issues around political activities in different parts of the world. And if you step back and ask yourself, where are we headed as a world, right? And so I thought about this morning in preparing my thoughts for this conversation. I put the world on two tracks, right? I put it on the track of total devastation, sort of a Armageddon, apocalyptic, and I put the world on the track of restoration, rebuilding, you know, and being sustainable. And I think what separates those two trajectories is trust, right? I think the more we trust, the likely the opportunity of us to be on the left trajectory, which is the trajectory that I just said that will take us in a much more sustainable future. The more we distrust, and when I say distrust, not even just on a family level, but it's just metastasizing across the world. It's going to be difficult. And so my clarion call, especially for the younger generation, and even for us older, is if the younger generation trusts each other less than they do today, the world is headed for some serious crisis. So the reversal that needs to happen is how to get, we had 200 people on these calls. Each of them are in essence trust ambassadors. If each of those 200 people decide to have one question storming session on rebuilding trust, and each of those other 20 people on their sessions, we have a ripple effect. I think having 35 countries involved or over 25 countries is a very good opportunity to have this thing mushroom around the world. Since we announced the event and I put out the paper, I've gotten a lot of folks who are participating who said, what's going to happen next? But what's going to happen next is Clint Vince is going to have his question storming with his friends. Paula Gill will have hers with her friends. Christine will have hers with her friend. If we start to do that and start having question storming about trust and really bring this to the fore, I think you will get to see more and more people, even of different political ideology, sit down and try to experiment. Bring someone who you know is leaning on one side of the political spectrum, bring them in the room with someone leaning on the other side of the spectrum, and have a question storming session with them. And you'll be surprised at the end of the session, they may realize that they actually have more in common than they have that's separate. So I think the real challenge for us is creating that space, the safe space for people to come there. And I think the only way to have the safe space is to remove all titles. I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, liberal, whatever it is, you're just another human being trying to solve a big problem facing the world. If we can do that, you will see trust sort of a turnaround, and the deficit we have today will become a surplus.
you know, Lawrence, my partner Emma Hand is the genius at setting up organizational structures to accomplish goals like this. Our law firm's in 80 countries. I'm going to ask Emma to figure out a way to do this at our next partnership meeting. It's such a sound, impressive suggestion. I had, when I participated with you at Saunders Place in Georgetown, I really had never experienced anything quite like it. And it really was well received by at least everyone in our focus group. Before I call on Steve to give his reflections, and then Christine and Paula, what were a couple of the questions that were asked either by your youthful focus group or any of your groups that were most impactful to each of you? Just a couple of them as an example.
Then you're gonna go first?
No, go ahead, Lawrence.
I think two of them that come to mind is one has to do with, have you ever seen trust being rebuilt? You can easily lose trust, but some people ask the question, how do you rebuild trust? The question was, have you ever seen the process of trust being rebuilt? And I thought that was a very interesting question, because I asked myself, is there anyone in my family or in my life that I don't trust? And how do I start to trust them, or when did I start to trust them? So that was one that stood out. The other one that stood out is the sort of the inverse. Have you seen the process where a trust surplus went to a trust deficit? And the first that comes to my mind is human relationships, where when you have this spark when a relationship starts, it's all the way up there, and all of a sudden something happens that triggers. But that decline doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. And the question is, when you see the shift in the trajectory, when it starts going downhill, you need to catch it quickly. So being able to catch the trajectory downhill before it becomes a deficit is one of those things I think was very intriguing. So for me, it's like, okay, can I really trust this person? Well, when does it start happening? And can I catch the decline of trust before it becomes a problem?
Well, and I'll add to that, Lawrence. I think there were two questions that really epitomized for me what's happening with cities around the world. One was around technology. I work with clients that are involved with artificial intelligence, drones, robotics, 5G, IoT, everything around technology is shaping our world. But are we allowing it to run our world, or are we seeing it as the enabler of these changes in our society and the changes in the quality of life? I think a lot of people are overwhelmed by this technology and actually the breathtaking capabilities of it. Can we put it to work to help our cities in meaningful ways that really get to the social issues you mentioned, Clint, and to the people part of our connections to each other? The other question that was really interesting, and we saw it, I think in New Zealand and certainly faraway parts of the world, what is the connection between trust and nature? Can we mimic nature to be more productive as a society? Can we be a nature-based community? Can we be a plant-based eating society? I mean, a lot of people, I think, are thinking about where can we put nature back into our lives to stop deforestation, to do something about the rise of sea level, to do something about the intensity and frequency of all these huge weather events. And whether we can or not, I think is still up for attention. But I think all of the people that are involved in cities today are seeing a reason to work with nature rather than to fight against her. And it came out in our question storming quite strongly.
Terrific point. When Lawrence was speaking, it triggered a thought, a really kind of humorous anecdote. Years ago, for the most unlikely reasons, Bob Dole and I became very good friends. And he, of course, was Senate Majority Leader for the Republican Party, conservative Republican. me, a Democrat. And at one point, Senator Dole asked the managing partner of his law firm to recruit me and our team, our energy team. And the managing partner called me up and he said, you know, Bob Dole has said I need to hire you guys. He said, he paid you the greatest compliment that I've ever heard. And I started to sit up in my chair and puff my chest out. And I thought, what could be this compliment from such a great man? And the managing partner chuckled and he said, yes, he called you a moderate Democrat. and that really, to me, sums up, I mean, the relationship we had and that I had with a number of Republican leaders really summed up how, at least in the past, we used to be able to have great friendships and sharing of ideas, and we see that diminished so much right now. But let me call on.
Sorry,
Yeah.
if I can just interject, because you always do this to me. You say these things and you expect to let it go, because I can't let it go, because you just brought a very interesting thought to my mind here, coming back to what Paula was saying. You know, the example you just gave speaks to this importance of when I said trust was neutral and political agnostic. If you just listen to the different media outlets and listen to the questions they're asking, you'll notice that many times they're asking the same question. The problem is they cannot just ask the question. They always ascribe something to the question that reveals their political ideology. And I would love a world where we ban all labels when it comes to question storming. Because when you're asking the question actually has no label to it. It's just a question. And when you go to see a medical doctor, what do doctors do well? They ask you questions. They ask a lot of questions. They keep asking questions until they diagnose your problem. Can you imagine if the doctor said, well, that question the question I'm about to ask you is more left-leaning or right-leaning or middle center? You never live, right? So I think the more we can I believe questions can drive the world. I really believe that if we were to use questions as the real engine, as opposed to statements, I think statements actually destroy the world, because statements come with such potency sometimes that makes it so difficult. So I'm really sort of showing you my own biases here, because I've become so question addicted. But I really think that questions are the fuel for the world. Statements, many of them are just potent.
Well, great closing comment. Let me ask Christine and then Paula to close us out.
No, this has just been so impressive this morning listening. I absolutely want our staff to be embedded in this idea of questions and question storming. And I think it will really elevate our work. And there's certainly a lot I learned from this today. And I want to do it with my family too. We got some things that we can use this for as well. So I just appreciate everyone. This is terrific, just terrific.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Christine. Thanks for joining in with us with Keystone today. Paula.
I too, I've been really sitting here thinking differently. I mean, I've anchored my career on it, but I want to tell you that I believe that every once in a while you have to immerse yourself to be active in new conversations and refresh conversations. So I want to thank you both, Sandra and Lawrence. I think you've done some phenomenal work, and I do believe that we have to share this idea and cascade it and shake it up. So thank you. And Clint, once again, thanks for being such a great partner. Dentons is a wonderful organization, and Keystone is just proud to keep partnering with you on great conversations like these today. And thank you very much, Emma. I know your face is out there and I know you're out there. So thank you both.
Emma's getting everything done while I've been talking, as always. And I know that that Steve and his team had to leave, and that's why we started a little bit early today. But in absentia, I want to thank him for his great contributions as well. And his publication is so inclusive, and I think has done a great deal to improve trust. I was really shocked when he mentioned that his publication gets hate mail. That's a scary thing for me. But special thanks to Lawrence and Sandra, Christine, Paula, for this really terrific discussion today. I'm inspired, and I hope that everyone listening in will be as well. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Bye-bye.
Great job.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.